Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Iacovelli, Alder Avenue Middle School Library, here with this week's edition of First Chapters, where I read the first chapter of a book, and hopefully it will pique your interest in that book. This week we are featuring Freedom Stone, which is a book by Jeffrey Kluger, and I thought this book was interesting because when I was genrifying the library, as you know, our books are in order by genre. I put this book in the historical fiction section of the library because it's about takes place during the Civil War, and it's about slaves living on a plantation at one particular family. And as I read the book, I realized that the Freedom Stone that the title refers to is a magical stone. So the book needed to be moved to the fantasy section of the library because magic kind of supersedes everything. So if there's magic in it, it becomes a fantasy no matter what else is going on. So anyway, the book is very good. I thought I'd highlight it this week. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit different type of fantasy than from what we usually say. So without any further ado, here is the first chapter of Freedom Stone by Jeffrey Kluger. There were two kinds of slaves on the plantation Lily and her family called home. Those who could sleep on the night before the slave seller came, and those who couldn't. Lily's little brother was too young to understand exactly what the job of the slave seller was, so this morning, just before sunrise, on the day the terrible man was going to arrive, the boy lay deeply sleeping beside her in the narrow bed the two of them shared. Mama knew the slave seller well, having seen too many of his visits over the years, and watched too many people she knew and even loved getting sold off like prize heads of livestock. For much of the night, Mama had thus tossed and thrashed in her bed on the other side of the family's little cabin, giving in to sleep only in the last hour or so. Lily had slept even less than Mama, drifting in and out of a fitful doze for much of the night and awakening fully a short time ago, just as the sky was beginning to show a faint shimmer of dawn outside her window. As most of the slaves on the plantation knew, the slave seller was not actually a slave seller at all. What he was, or at least what the white family called him, was a slave appraiser, a man whose sole job was to visit plantations throughout the county, examine the slaves working there, and report back to the auctioneers about which ones looked likely to bring in the highest price. Slaves who were selected this way were usually gone within a month and almost never seen again. Rumors had been swirling around for weeks that the appraiser would be making his rounds soon, and that was no surprise. The last harvest had been a poor one at Green Frog, which was what the plantation where Lily lived was called, and the war between the North and South, now in its third year, was making money even harder to come by throughout Beaufort County and the rest of South Carolina, too. Masters who could not raise enough cash selling their crops would often turn to selling some slaves. Yesterday, just after the quitting horn sounded, the overseer called the Green Frog slaves together in a field near the stables and announced that their master had decided that some of them would have to go, and they'd all be priced for sale in the morning. This, of course, was the worst news a group of slaves could hear, but the master had tricks to try to make them forget that, or at least think about it a little less. Last night, as on all nights before the appraiser came, an extra ration of pork, pink and fresh killed, not salted and dried, was distributed to all the cabins. Fresh pork was said to brighten moods and soften skin, giving the slaves a healthy, well-fed look that auctioneers liked to see. The pork had been delicious. It was always delicious before slave appraiser days, and Lily's little brother had stuffed himself with it. Despite her worries, Lily could not resist it either. Mama would not eat a bite. Even better than the ham the slaves ate was the rest they'd get. Today, the morning horn would sound a bit later than usual, and there would be no field work to do. Well-rested slaves were also thought to be more appealing to the appraiser. For Lily, however, and for all the other slaves who lay awake on the night before the slave seller came, extra time to sleep just meant extra time to brood. And as morning now broke, Lily found herself staring ahead into the shadows of the cabin, her mind filled with thoughts of sorrow that at least one family would feel before the sun went down on Green Frog again. Lily stole a glance at her sleeping brother, who was called Plato, and envied him the things he did not know. She was 13 now, old enough to understand when trouble was coming, but she had been barely the boy's age which was 6 the first time the appraiser called. Back then, if Mama and Papa told her not to worry about what was going on, she wouldn't worry. If they told her that none of them would ever be sold away or flogged, she believed that too. When a child was marked for sale and its mother dropped to her knees and wailed with that terrible animal sound, Mama would pick Lily up and carry her off and sing in her ear so close and strong that the sound of the weeping woman's screams would seem to fall away. But Lily was too old to pick up now, too old to sing, and too old to believe that good things were going to happen just because Mama said they were. All the other children who'd lost a family member to the slave traders had had mamas who told them the same things, and that hadn't helped them a lick. As Lily lay in bed, lost in these dark thoughts, a terrible choking feeling came over her, and her skin went prickly hot with fear. In time, the sun would be up, and she would face the day as well as she could, which she reckoned would probably be good enough. But here in the still dark cabin, in the low ceiling and the deep silence, and even the thin, scratchy blanket under which she lay seemed all at once as if they would suffocate her. She flung off the blanket, causing her brother to stir slightly, and drew 3 or 4 deep, trembly breaths. She needed to get up. She needed to be outside, at least until day broke and her mama awoke. And she needed to go see her friend Bet. Ever since Lily had been old enough to explore the plantation on her own, spending time with Bet had lifted her mood. Bet was an old slave who lived on a tiny patch of unfarmed land just beyond the tobacco field. She spent nearly all of her adult life working the ovens in the master's kitchen, baking cakes and muffins and loaves of bread and all manner of sweets and treats. When Bet was too old for big housework, the master had allowed the other slaves to build her a cabin of her own where she could live out her remaining years. She would still be required to work, of course, but now it would be for the other slaves alone, baking their weekly portions of bread, which the mamas were usually too busy in the fields to make their own. Bet had been old for as long as Lily could remember, but no one seemed to know her exact age, including Bet herself, who also didn't seem to care. There ain't but 2 states of things, she liked to say. There's alive and there's dead. I expect there'll be one until I'm the other. When Lily was feeling sad or cross, she'd often as not find her way to Bet's cabin, where she would help with the cleaning or water fetching or sometimes even the baking itself, and would always get something fine and fresh baked for her troubles. All the same, Lily had not visited Bet much in the last year. She had an older girl's thoughts and an older girl's troubles now, and was not so easily soothed by child's work and a child's reward. This morning, however, the comforts of Bet felt like just what she needed. Lily glanced toward the window at the faintly brightening sky. Bet, she knew, would surely be awake now. She made it her business to be up before the sun. If Lily hurried to her cabin now, she could help herself to one of the old woman's smiles, and perhaps a bite of her fresh baked bread, and be back before her brother and Mama even knew she was gone. Quietly, Lily climbed out of bed. She was wearing nothing but her nightshirt, but it was long enough, nearly to her knees, to protect her against the morning chill and against being punished for going about undressed should anyone spot her. She tiptoed toward the door, taking care not to make the floorboards creak. She cast a nervous glance back toward Plato and Mama, and then, before her courage could fail her, slipped out the front door. The pebbly soil outside the cabin felt damp and gritty against Lily's feet, and she shuddered a bit at the touch of it. She looked ahead toward the tobacco field and set off in its direction in a light trot. It was early September, and the days were still hot in the Carolinas, but the mornings were cool and pleasant, and Lily enjoyed the feeling of the air against her face and her bare arms and legs. Running through the tobacco plants, she squinted toward the edge of the field where Bet's cabin lay. As she drew closer, she picked up the scent of baking on the air and smiled. It smelled like cornbread, and it smelled fine, but it also surprised her. Bet always baked her morning bread the night before, and on most days she did not light her oven much before noon. Still, the smell alone helped to lift Lily's mood. It was almost as if Bet knew she'd be coming and knew what she'd need. Bet did seem to know such things without being told, a fact that delighted Lily most of the time, and spooked her a little at other times. At last Lily broke out of the field and into the clearing where the little cabin stood. She could see the curl of white cook smoke rising from the small chimney, and she came to a stop, scanning the quiet scene. As she did, her eyes widened in surprise. Bet raised a thick garden of flowers and vegetables behind her cabin, and that garden often drew a thick cloud of bees. But there was something queer about Bet's bees, or at least sometimes there was. Unlike most bees, which could fly a lot faster than a person could duck and run, Bet's bees were often strangely slow. Their wings moved with the sleepy sweep of swan wings. They floated from flower to hive so lazily that Lily could sometimes beat them there at a walk. And if one of them came across her enough to sting, she could step out of the way and brush it out of the air with barely a thought. Few other people ever saw the bees, just a slave child now and then who might be playing nearby and whose story of having seen such a thing was never believed by an adult. Lily and her brother did see the bees. They took to calling them the slow bees and loved to watch them when they appeared. "Quick," Lily would call, "the slow bees is about," and Plato would come running. Now, in the just breaking sun, Lily could see that the slow bees were everywhere, massing around the garden, thick and dark as a rain cloud, as if they too had been drawn by the baking. This many bees could sting a horse to death, no matter how slowly they were moving. Lily didn't want to consider what they could do to a child like her. She took a step back and started to turn away, but at that moment the door to the cabin creaked open and Bet appeared. She looked as she always did, small, stout, strong, but she looked older and wearier too, as if baking so early in the day was too much for her. "I reckon I see you this morning, child," she said with a small smile, "but it's best you not be here now." Lily was surprised. Bet had never turned her away before. "I felt like visiting," she said uncertainly. "I know," Bet said. "I expected you would. But there's matters I have to mind this morning." Lily glanced toward the bees, but Bet did not follow her gaze. "Come later," Bet said. "Later there'll be cornbread for you." Bet closed the door, and Lily stood where she was for a moment. Then she turned and walked off, thoughts of the slave appraiser once again filling her head, and the low buzzing of the bees filling her ears. So you can see there's a little bit of magic already jumping into this book where the children can see the bees and the adults cannot. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I could tell you a little bit more. Her dad gets the slave owners of the South offer anybody who volunteers for the Confederate Army freedom for their family. So her dad decides that he has to fight for the Confederate Army to so that his family could possibly be freed, and he ends up getting killed during the Civil War. He's accused of stealing something, and this Freedom Stone helps them find the truth. And now I'll leave it at that. Okay, there will be an exit slip to go along with this first chapter of Freedom Stone, which is a great book, and I hope you enjoyed our first chapters this week, and I will talk to you guys soon.